culture. Again, the title is on language, culture, and thought, a UU forum and discussion on the power of language. And this grew out of an earlier forum presentation, I'm going to say / discussion with Vicky and Peter around this topic of really how language does shape our culture and thought. And they were kind enough to spend time developing that idea, and they are now here to present it to us and engage us. So I don't need to kind of give you the whole description because we're obviously going to participate in it, but just a little intro. What is the power of language? Does the form of our language push us to think in certain tracks? Does it mire us in unquestioned ideologies and pathways? Can it move us to think in new and different ways? Do the words and expressions of other cultures have something to teach us in the ways they articulate or don't different concepts? Yeah, what a powerful idea, topic that we're going to be thinking about today. So again, thank you both, Vicky and Peter, for your willingness to put this together. A little background, Vicky is a professor emerita of linguistics, retiring from the humanities department at Michigan Tech in 2021. Her research and teaching focused on language and its cognitive, social, and political effects, starting with her senior thesis at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, and continuing through her PhD at Harvard, including a Fulbright to Kenya for 9 months in 1983-84, up through today. Peter is a professor emeritus of anthropology, retiring from Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee in 2007. His BS is in geology from Beloit College. He has an MA in Latin American Studies from American University. His PhD is from the University of Illinois. His fieldwork and research has focused on ecological anthropology in South America and especially Ecuador, where he served in the Peace Corps after college. So again, I'm so pleased that you're going to present to us today. And there'll be, I imagine we might have some discussion during the presentation, but we'll definitely have time for Q&A after the presentation. But I will make a note that we'll for sure wrap things up no later than 11:45, but maybe it'll be a little sooner than that, just so people have time to transition to the annual meeting. Okay, so Vicky and Peter, we're ready for you.
Okay, so I'm going to point this towards me a little bit, and I'll point it towards Peter for his part. So we each decided we'd take maybe about 10 minutes to go over this. We really considered this to be a topic more for a roundtable. We thought that it'd be wonderful to be all in the same room and live and doing all this, but of course forums don't happen that way. So maybe at some future point we can all maybe meet in our back deck and have a discussion about this. But this is something that I thought was an interesting topic, and it basically keyed off of something that Bucky Beach was talking about earlier. I don't know if Bucky's on, but I will thank him later. He referenced the phrase that there are no words for goodbye in Navajo, and I want to talk more about that later. But also something he used in another sermon, preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. So striking me as a linguist as an important topic about the limits of language in some ways. So I wanted to talk about this in part because I think language is very powerful. As a linguist, of course, I'm quite convinced of that. But I thought it'd be interesting to draw in Peter because he's an anthropologist, and I know that we have another anthropologist among us with Linda and other people who have background in some of these different ways. And so I wanted to raise some issues that we could then go on and talk about. So I think that language is important. We will talk a little bit coming up about covenants and such, but so one of the things that I want to talk about is how do language, culture, and thought articulate together? How are they influencing and influenced by one another? And does language really influence the way we see the world? So the philosopher writer Frederick Jameson called language the prison house of language, that we get involved in these walls that limit our ways of thinking about the world. That is known as a strong linguistic relativity hypothesis. Sapir and Worf wrote about this, although not quite in the ways that they're quoted as doing, but they talked about how language is a tool for dividing up the world as we see it and giving labels and names to things. And we think a lot about the world in the categories that our language gives us. And I'll talk more about some of the limits of that as well. So he saw language as this prison house, or I think of it as a railroad tracks. You get on these railroad tracks that sort of have you thinking in a certain way. Now, there's also the weaker linguistic relativity position, which is that language is sort of like the ruts of the Oregon Trail. You can get out of the ruts and travel in other ways. You're not limited with, unless you break an axle on your wagon, but you can find many ways to Oregon. There's not only one way. So one of the things that has interested me is this battle between the professor I had at MIT, Noam Chomsky, who is a linguistic universalist who believes that all languages have underlying similar structures and they say the same things. So the idea that Navajo doesn't have a word for goodbye, but English does, suggests that the no word for X trope, that one language has a way of parceling out the universe that another language doesn't. So you may have heard the Eskimo words for snow, the fact that Eskimo has 10 or 20 or 500 words for snow is actually been falsified by linguists who say, no, actually that's an artifact of the way that these kinds of languages, many Native American languages, have a core root of a word to which you add prefixes and suffixes. And so just like we can say it snows, it's snowing, snowballs, snowstorm, we have a lot of different words for snow that use snow. The agglutinating languages of the Inuit people and the people of Northland have many different things you could say, like she is throwing a snowball. It is a snow cornice. The snow is hanging over the roof. And those are all words in that language. So the whole idea of word for snow has been debunked by Jeff Pullum and other people, Laura Martin, an anthropologist, as being sort of an exoticization of the variation. So these linguists, the universalists, believe really there isn't any big difference in the languages. The fact that there are genders for different things is not really significant on like the, in German, it's der Mond, the moon is male, but la lune in French. So we have different ways of talking about the moon and a lot of different things that go along with the masculization and the feminization of the moon and such. So Lyra Boroditsky, who Bucky also referenced, is a person who believes in the linguistic relativity hypothesis. She is a multilingual, and she has an interesting TED Talk if you want to go look for it. And one of the things about her research is that she really has done research to try to tease out whether there are ways that the way we talk about language can influence our thinking about it. And she has pointed out that bilinguals, for example, Arabic and Jewish, Hebrew-speaking bilinguals have different ways of seeing the war and the warlikeness of people, depending on whether they're speaking in Hebrew or Arabic and which language they're speaking. And so she has tried to tease out all over the world different ways that languages have for ordering the universe. One thing that happens in the people who live, one of the Aboriginal groups of Australia, order the world in terms of spatial orientation. So they will order the world in terms of east to west. And we will have left to right. You put people in a room, a crowded lecture room, she says, and she'll ask them, close their eyes and point to the north. And they're pointing all sorts of different directions. And these are all sorts of people all over the world. She's tried it at Harvard, Stanford, a lot of different places, and nobody knows where they are. You ask a person in this culture of Northern Australia, and they immediately point to the east. And they order if they point to the north, they know which way, but the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and they order their whole world around this. And so there's a lot of spatial and temporal organization that comes from our language. The fact that our language is written left to right makes us think that language goes in a left to right way. Hebrew, of course, and Arabic go the other direction. Chinese is written top down. So if you ask for someone about the past, in Chinese, they'll point up in some ways. For us, the past is up the left part of the timeline. But the Aymara people think the past is before you because you know what's happened in the past. but you don't know what's happening behind you in the future. So different ways of organizing the world, and I've got some interesting papers of Boroditsky I can recommend to you. So this business of linguistic relativity has been debated back and forth for many years. I happen to believe that language matters, and I think that I side with the linguistic relativists more so than the Chomskyists, although I'm a trained syntactician a la Chomsky. So one of the things that I think is really important is that the no word for X, just before I finish that, is that the structuralists, Chomsky and people like Steve Pinker or Jeff Pullum would say that we may not have a single word for this, but you will figure it out within a 2 or 3 word phrase or maybe a sentence. So nothing is untranslatable. It just may take us a few more words, but I want to talk about codability in a second. But I also want to raise the issue of power, language and power. One of the issues that Hodge and Kress, a couple of critical discourse analysts, the field I worked in for many years, talk about is the fact that those who control more forms of language have more power. And certainly it is the case that those in power have decided what will be the high and low forms of the language, because writing is generally a high form. So you'll find Demotic Greece, it's the low form, and you'll have the old form of Greek. So there's a high and low form. There's a high and low form of Arabic. So if you learn to read the Quran, you learn classical Arabic. And if you learn street language, it's a low form spoken by the people, but actually that is a different form. So we have in American culture, Yupper and other dialects of language that are considered to be by some people less civilized, less organized, less not grammatical, versus the high form of academe, of business, of Washington, although the language in Washington is another topic I'll raise. But certainly as a person who has learned a lot of different ways to talk and to write, I have control over language that other people might not have. So those who have control language control power in many ways. So one of the ways that we can talk about how language works in that way is fighting words, right? When language kind of goes wrong, so the incitement to riot or sedition, we know, has often been done with words. The whole discussion going on in politics right now about witch hunts versus the rule of law is largely a matter of words that have been shaping how people perceive the world. And we've seen recently, again, the discussion of hurtful words, right? That hurtful words, and I'll talk more about some of those coming up in a second, should be legislated out, maybe some people think, but other people think that the solution, this is ACLU's version, the solution to bad speech is more speech as opposed to trying to suppress speech. So we can talk about any of these topics more, and this I'm just painting lightly over some topics, skating over them so we can get onto them. I do want to say a few words about when language isn't useful. For example, if you're trying to explain to someone who can't see the glory of a sunset, there just aren't words to describe that vision that we're seeing, or the smell of the lilacs that we were talking about earlier, or the sounds of music don't really translate into words very well. It's much better to get a hug and a kiss from your sweetheart than to have nothing's whispered to you or sent over email. It doesn't quite have the same effect. There's something singular about the communion of persons in close harmony that makes a difference that somehow language doesn't always make up for. It's better to have a good hug than to send my thoughts and wishes to all of you, I suppose. But the pain index is another thing. If you're trying to describe your pain, well, they now have these little circles, right? You can go to the doctor's office and say, I've got a 4. But what's a 4 on the pain index? It may not describe the kind of hurt that you're feeling. So words have their failings. They're not everything. And several of us have been reading a book about the Umwelt of different animals that can experience better vision, a more sense with their nose. So dogs can outdo us in many ways in scenting things. We understand that there are supersonic and subsonic sounds that we can't hear. There are colors we can't see. There are various things we can't experience. And so if you want to read about the Umwelt of animals, we've got some recommendations for you there. I want to talk for a second about some of the reasons that language does work, and that is codability. So one thing about that variation of different languages is that a language may have a word for something that's very important. So think about the word liberty for us. It encodes all sorts of things, from the Liberty Bell to the Statue of Liberty to the Sons of Liberty to the Fight for Liberty. But svoboda is the same word in badly pronounced Russian, probably, but their freedom or liberty may be a different freedom. It was explained to me as a freedom from want, freedom from hunger, although Russian breadlines, although other things may happen. The words may not have all the resonances that a good poet might have by evoking liberty, or a good writer might have. So sometimes having a word for something can help to be a center around which we attach other meanings. That can be very useful when we're talking about things like, hold on, there's a thought that just went through my brain. I'll come back to that one. Okay, I forgot it. So, okay, I know. Our version of, no, sorry, go on. Okay, one other way, sorry, too many things happening here. I'll just go on. There's so many things to say. One thing that language gives us is precision. So I asked my students to draw the sign that says, no left turn or no right turn. That's pretty simple to do. You can have a sign that does that. But if you see the parking sign that says no parking in Houghton between November 1st and April 30th, what you find is that, between 11 and 7 or something in the morning, you cannot express that with pictures. There's no way to draw a compact sign that would have all that information. So sometimes that's very codable to have those words. It simplifies our ways of talking. Or with law, it can complexify our ways of talking about things, but make it very clear who's responsible for various things under law. So we regard law as a precision. I'm not so sure politics is so precise. We recognize there are politics of language. George Orwell was very concerned about language that was used to misshape the way we think. If you read 1984, read the appendix, which is about newspeak, the politics of language, where he talks about the harms of doublespeak, which is shown in the movie itself or the book itself, where, for example, the Ministry of War has been named mini-pax, suggesting peace. The mini-plenty is the responsibility for distributing the limited amount of food and suggests plenty, which is, of course, trying to paste over reality by certain words. We do that all the time with euphemisms. We talk about raising taxes, but if you don't want to talk about that bad word, you can say revenue enhancements. Or we don't have layoffs, but we have pink slips, or involuntary separation, or retrenchment or redundancy. You are never dead, but someone's passed away or passed on, no longer with us, in a better place, or even pushing up daisies. We use euphemisms often for very difficult things. So for bodily functions that we don't want to talk about, we have many Anglo-Saxon and other kinds of words to talk about that. If you've ever prayed before the porcelain toilet, a porcelain throne after a party, you know that there are many words that are euphemisms for drinking, for being drunk and things like that, and for sex and bodily functions. But can we do language for good? Can we have language that would change people's minds for good? I think so. I'm a big believer in the positive use of language, for example, to have pronouns that we use, and we've remodeled the pronoun system to use they for someone who identifies as non-binary, and also for a gender-neutral single person. So if anyone wants to succeed, they should work hard, not he should work hard. So we've replaced a lot of he, man language with other ways of talking, such things as using server rather than waitress. These days you're declared husband and wife, perhaps, rather than man and wife. Why does marriage get to make him a man but make me a wife, for example? We have a lot of inclusive LGBT language now, that we have a lot of phrases, not just any longer gay, but also lesbian and other variations on that spectrum. Some people take the word queer and have changed that word. That offends some people. Some people have the idea that we didn't really legislate against marital rape or spousal abuse until we had things like those terms to do so. The domestic abuse is been something we can now charge someone with that wasn't considered to be a crime before. We had the words for it. So words can help us to do certain kinds of legal work as well. I want to get Pete to talk more about the translatability question. You know, do I ever understand what a speaker of a different language would be saying? Do we have really an ability to really understand anyone who comes from a different culture? Those universalists like Chomsky would say, oh yeah, it's all translatable. But Quine talks about the Gavagai problem. Say you're on an island and no other people have ever come there from your group, but you have this person who maybe can use a few words, and you see a white rabbit crossing the clearing in front of you, and you point to it and you say, what's that? And the person says Gavagai. Well, what are they saying? What does Gavagai mean? Does it mean rabbit? Does it mean white? Does it mean white rabbit because most rabbits are brown? Does it mean fast? Does it mean food for dinner? How do we ever know when we're translating among languages what really is meaningful? Well, a lot of trial and effect might work that through. So I just want to finish my part for this and let Pete talk for a few minutes. Why is this a question for use? Well, I think, believe in the power of language. We come to services and we listen to sermons and songs that we hope will inspire thought, stimulate discussion. It creates a way for us to articulate how we believe in the world. We can help us state our covenants and what we believe in and how we share those beliefs. It can help create community. And I think it can move us to action. So I'm interested in this topic and I'll be happy to talk about many more of these things and how it strikes you. And I'm going to stop now and turn to the anthropologist who may have more to say on these topics.
So much to say, so little time. I guess that's really true of me. One of the things I want to say is that Vicky is the linguist. I'm an anthropologist. I've had one course in language, in linguistics, and that was by a student of Chomsky's, one of his more articulate and believer, so to speak. So that's where I'm coming from on language, on linguistics. But language and culture are part of the same thing, in a sense. Language is a part of culture, but a very super important part of culture. Culture is a means in words to describe what we do and what others do. We invent it, so to speak. We use it as a tool to and a control in order to understand both other language speakers and certainly peoples that have other cultures with a small c. One of the things that really struck me in talking with Vicky was we all got excited about this, and it was really pleasant to have those conversations. And I learned so much from her, and hopefully she learned a few things from me. But I think that speaks to the fact that both language and culture, their differences, different languages and different cultures that we at least call different cultures, are ways of learning, are ways of understanding others and ourselves, of also inventing a culture for ourselves. In other words, if you're embedded in another culture, and anthropologists tend to do field work and try to work into the other culture that they're working with and living with in a very deep sort of way. And so you're confronted on a daily basis by not only the language, but the culture that it is a part of. And it can be very frustrating at first, but incredibly exhilarating as it goes along. And so understanding different languages, especially when they're embedded within a culture, not just learning it textbook wise, but that can help too, and is a way of learning ourselves and changing ourselves. And that's what humans do. They learn and they change depending on the situation. So I think the whole process of doing it and constructing these visions and so forth is a way that we have to understand different ways, different life ways, different ways of seeing things and hearing things. It's funny, we talk about seeing things all the time when we're talking about hearing things. And I think that's kind of a part of the way we look at the world. And also power. If you've ever lived in another society or culture for a long period of time and more or less embedded within it, especially one, and this is unfortunately, and there's ethical problems here, anthropologists have tended to study cultures that are not as material and powerful as our own. But if you do that for a long time, you begin yourself to start translating what you see as a control in culture, but you only see it at any time through your own eyes and your own ears and your other senses. That changes and you become more adept, but you're always comparing it to or translating it into what you are. And that changes, and that's the power of it. But there's this intractability of not being able to totally get out of it. You can be very adept and think you're bicultural and get away with it all the time, but you're coming at it, at least as an adult, of always comparing it, even if you're not consciously thinking that, to your own ways of doing things, and own ways of understanding. The other day, a person that I knew in Ecuador in the Peace Corps, and then later on, but I hadn't seen or talked to for a long period of time, gave me a call on the phone, which is amazing in itself. But I panicked because here I am, not having talked Spanish for a long time, talking to somebody on a phone. And that worked out all right, but it took a while to get over that. And when I first went to Ecuador, I'm not great on languages, learning languages. I could do all right after a while in conversation, that type of thing. But I always panicked when I had to, and that wasn't very often, pick up a phone and talk, because it's isolate speech. And you have the background, your culture and everything, and what you know of another group of people, but you don't have the motions, hand motions, you don't have all the nuances. You have hems and haws, but they don't mean the same thing within a larger context. So to me, language is part of a whole milieu of how we view there we go again, how we view the world, how we understand the world, how we fit in the world. Something along that same line, we took students, somebody from the religion department, philosophy department, and I down to Honduras. And at various times we had to give little talks in Spanish and vice versa, listening to talks. And they talk about the reality of Hondurans, the realidad hondureños, they Hondureños. And they look at that differently. They talk about reality, not just a different viewpoint, which encompasses a larger area. And I would always say, well, we're down there to learn what that is as much as we possibly can. Going back to the more academic linguistics and anthropology, again, because I had that one course by a Chomsky accolade, I was kind of interested at the time, it was of an interest in anthropology, especially, of what underlies culture. So I took away what underlies language or a language. And he talked about competence and performance, where performance were speech acts that you do all the time. And you can, words, sounds, all these types of things. And performance was something, or competence was something that underlay language, and not only a language, but at a deeper level, all languages. So I took that and there was some discussion of that in anthropology in a different sense, in structuralism, of looking for underlying patterns, underlying things that were within a cultural milieu, but also historical and possibly a Homo sapiens type of milieu. So that kind of is of interest to me too, to look underneath. And in language, typically you talk about syntax and phonetics and semantics, and meaning is always something that's incredibly elusive, and how we get at that meaning. And some of the talks we've had, one of our people that give sermons, take care of the services, talks about Buddhism. And I took some Oriental philosophy, it's wrong word, but that's what it was called then. And there are ways through meditation and other ways to kind of bypass a lot of the linguistics, a lot of the language, and a lot of the thought processes. In Zen Buddhism and in Taoism, I believe, you're supposed to get at, a true understanding of your place in the world by getting away from any intellectual type of thing. In other words, in Zen, it's this, not that. You can't talk about it, and then you lose it. So in terms of thought, I don't know if you really would call that thought, but it's a way of clearing away culture and language to get at some other type of understanding of the world or the reality around you. And so that's kind of interesting, to move away from that which makes us so adaptable in the world and makes us who we are, is get away from all that detritus. Think of driving a car, an old stick shift. If you thought about, well, I've got to let the clutch out at a certain amount of time, and then I have to speed up at a certain time, you're going to jog all over the place. It's going to be a disaster. But if it becomes a part of you, you don't think about it, everything works smoothly. When you look more at language, for instance, and power of language, some of that stuff works the same way. If you institute a certain language or a certain way of speaking and institutionalize it, or it becomes institutionalized, it's power, because that gives privilege to a certain way of speech and language that can become natural. In other words, beyond critique, natural history. And I think of Linnaeus, and I think of sending people out, Europeans out throughout the world, to write down in Latin a description of all living things. And they did that. It was a really, people would write back and, okay, I found a new species. It wasn't new. There were people that already called it by another name. And, but in this case, it was Latin, because that was European and it was not a living language. And so you didn't have the fight between, if it was Swedish or if it was German or if it was French, but it was European. So it's a way of, maybe not consciously, but of Europeanizing the world through language. Now that's writing, and speech and writing are different. And we always tend to, because we're a literate society and have a literate history, to think they're the same things. They're not. In the Andes, for instance, the Incas conquered a whole huge area of geography, from the coast to the mountains to, in some places, down to the tropical forests, and from, northern Peru all the way up to through Ecuador and to Colombia. And they did that without what we would think of as a written language. They had a way through knotted strings and so forth, and specialized people that were able to understand those, to account for things and to count things, and in some ways probably be more than that, but it wasn't a full-blown writing. which is incredible when you think about it, the geography that they had to use. They also spread a language, maybe for the first time, maybe not, depending on how you look at it. But I'm looking at Linda and Jim there. But Quechua or Quechua was spread over the whole empire as a lingua franca, so to speak, not French, but that's what empires do. Language, or what conquerors do. Language moves with people. So if you look at language and spreads of languages and related languages, you get an idea of where people have moved. Very seldom is it ever spread without people. I can't think of really in any important way that would happen. So all these things are part of language being a part of culture. They're power laden, they're nuanced. Language itself, sounds are, usually if you chart them on a graph or turn them into a visual thing, it's a continuum, but we hear it in different ways and chop it up in certain ways, and that's also a part of language. Different things, history. We make history, we invent history, just like we do culture and a lot of other things. In other words, history, the United States history from an African-American perspective is very different than a white privileged version of history. And we're certainly seeing that now. And it's a very power laden. People get all upset about that. What are you going to teach kids in school and that type of thing? So that's power. That's real power. And we see that playing out today. History is a way, and mythology, may I say, and other things that we tend to see other people that are very different from us, we give code words to it. Is this really religion? Is this really history they're talking about? It's not written down. Is that what history is? Something that's just written down? Some people might say that. But it's from a particular point of view, and it's derives its meaning from where you're coming from. There's a feminist history. There's an African-American history in this country, and you can list a whole bunch of others, and they'll be different because it's something in the past that we don't have direct relationship to, and so it has to be constructed and created. Another thing that I found interesting about linguistics was this whole notion of creativity and generation, that we can spin off things very easily and we can get around it. The translatability sort of thing, we're constantly doing that in our own lives, between individuals, much less between other groups of people, and huge differences that we see in some other cultures. And cultures, they're not encapsulated. They're not like atoms. We tend to look at that too, in a sort of way. They're constantly adjusting to things. And the more you adjust to things, the more you have to adjust to other things, because you've adapted in a way that then you've got to do it all over again. So it's a constant progression, a constant change that's going on. And in terms of the notion of language being separate, and it has its own kind of iron cage, it can, depending on other things in culture, to construct that, but I see it as generating from a spot that was in some sense universal. And that's another Chomskyan thing. But I thought of, you take a baby, that's a constant thing, at 1 year old, and pluck him from his mother and put it in another place that has a totally different language. It's going to learn that language perfectly well. If you left it where it was, it'll learn that language perfectly well for what it hears. So something about what it hears and what it has in its mind is part of the ability that we have to speak a language. And you could use that, at least metaphorically, in terms of culture too. You know, we have the possibility of constructing almost an infinite number of cultures within our biology, at any rate, or which might eventually control that. But we choose and we construct and invent it the way it is. I do that. Everybody does that within a certain milieu. If you took that same child at 1 year old and put it in a different culture, you know, it'd learn and operate within that culture and not the one that was plucked from. So that's something to explain there. One more thing, and we'll need some time to talk here. There are different notions of words that have a lot of power too. And where I worked in Ecuador, for the most part, it was a population that considered themselves as essentially non-Indian, but if I'd come there 50 years before, that probably wouldn't have been the case. That's a very fluid word. And I lived in the plaza for the most part. This is a very tiny place. And people would call each other, especially at a certain level, Don and Doña, Don Rafico, Doña Emalinda. And I would do that too. And it was kind of playful in a way. These are very honorific type terms that comes from Spain. You know, you speak to people at a higher level if they were Don or Doña. But I did that all the time, and they did that all the time with me and with themselves, depending who the people were. So I got used to that. Well, my daughter married an Argentinian, and his aunt and godmother, a really neat person by the name of Tucci, or that was her nickname, really. And she was a very assertive and independent-minded person. So I like to kid around with her, and I called her Doña Tucci. And after a while, she came to me and said, "Don't call me that. That's not a good thing. I'm not a Doña." And so different culture, different understanding of one word, and you know, I had to learn all over again, in essence. Anyway, I could go on and on. I don't want to at this point. So let's open it up, and I'll give it back to Vicky.
Okay, so if you want to unmute yourself or put your name into chat, take up any of these many threads we have been leaving totally open here. We could go on and on. I've met Pete 3 or 4 times and talked for a couple of hours each time. So this is fodder for much more conversation, but we'd like to hear what you have to think.